During the Middle Ages, social status determined everything, from what you ate to whether you lived or died. If you weren't born noble, you'd likely die as poor as you started, but there were hidden paths to wealth that could transform a butcher's son into the second most powerful man in England, or a merchant into Europe's richest banker. Here's how people actually got filthy rich in the Middle Ages. So yeah, if these stories work for you, subscribe. And I'm curious, what time is it where you are? Comment below. Last week someone from Canada said they listened during lunch breaks. Not judging, just wasn't expecting that. Okay, tonight it's the Middle Ages. But before we go anywhere, get cozy. Like, actually cozy. Pillows good? Blanket situation handled? Perfect. Trust me on this one. Your eyes snap open in complete darkness. For a second, you have no idea where you are. The straw mattress beneath you pokes through the thin fabric, stabbing into your back. The smell hits you next. Smoke from last night's fire, unwashed bodies, and something vaguely animal. You're in a castle, not the Disney kind, with pristine towers and fluttering flags. The real deal, a damp, drafty stone fortress in 14th century Europe. You're cold, really cold. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and stays there all day. Nothing like your warm bed right now, with its thermostat-controlled comfort. My lord, the king summons you. A servant bursts through the wooden door of your chamber. Great, it's barely dawn and already the day brings demands. But when a king calls, you answer instantly, because in medieval Europe, the king isn't just the boss. He's the ultimate power, the literal owner of everything you can see. Tell him I'll be there immediately, you say, swinging your legs over the bed's edge. As you dress in your finest clothes, which, let's be honest, probably haven't been washed in months, let me explain how wealth worked for the medieval fighting class. See, medieval society operated on what they called the three estates: those who fight, those who pray, and those who work. And if you wanted money, power, and a shot at dying of gout instead of starvation, being in the first group was your best bet. The medieval world wasn't big on social mobility. You think switching careers is hard now? Try being born a peasant in 1300. You're basically stuck, but within each estate, especially the fighters, there were ways to climb. Wait, you're probably thinking, fighting? How does that make you rich? I mean, have you seen what soldiers get paid today? Well, here's the thing about medieval wealth. It wasn't just about coins, it was about land. Whoever controlled the land controlled the people working it, and whoever controlled the people got a cut of everything they produced. At the very top of this pyramid sat the king, and boy, was it good to be king. Take Emperor Basil II of Byzantium. This guy ruled for 49 years from 976 to 1025, and he was so wealthy he makes modern billionaires look like they're scrounging for couch change. But unlike today's rich who flex with super yachts and space companies, Basil was actually pretty frugal with his personal stuff. You know what's funny about Basil, a scholar once told me. The guy was sitting on more gold than anyone alive and spent it all on his army instead of palaces. Medieval Jeff Bezos, but with actual troops. While other rulers blew their cash on fancy courts and banquets, Basil dumped his wealth into building the strongest military around. Smart move. Because he lived in a time when keeping your head attached to your shoulders was considered a successful retirement plan. And it worked. By the time he died, his empire was so financially stable it continued to thrive for decades. That's like if someone's 401k kept paying out for 3 generations after they died. Ridiculous levels of wealth. But here's the wild part about kings. Money wasn't even the most important form of their wealth. Sure, they had treasuries filled with gold, but their true power came from something less tangible. Influence, loyal armies, land ownership, and control over trade routes. Think about it. What good is gold if someone with a bigger army can just take it? Kings understood that real power came from controlling systems, not just hoarding treasure. Now let's say you weren't lucky enough to be born king. The next best thing being a noble. Below the king were three ranks of lords: dukes, earls and barons. These guys were known as tenants-in-chief because they got their land directly from the king. But here's the catch: the king could take it back any time. Talk about an unstable housing situation. In return for keeping their lands, nobles had to do two main things: show up to Parliament and fight for the king when called upon. But there was a limit. They only had to fight for 40 days each year. Anything beyond that, and they'd get paid extra. Medieval overtime, if you will. Picture this: you're an earl in 14th century England. Your morning view isn't a cramped apartment complex, it's miles of farmland, forests and villages, all producing income for you through rents. An earl could collect between $700 and $3,000 from his estates every year. That's roughly $420,000 to $1.8 million in today's money. Not bad, right? But one guy really took this to the extreme. Thomas, the second Earl of Lancaster, who died in 1322. This man wasn't just an earl, he was the Earl of Leicester, Derby, Lincoln and Salisbury all at once. In 1311, his annual income was around $11,000. Let me put that in perspective for you. That's equivalent to about 6.5 million today. From doing what exactly? Basically just owning land and collecting rent. The original passive income. So wait, you're probably thinking, why didn't everyone just become an earl? Well, that's the thing about medieval nobility. It was a closed club. You were either born into it or you needed some serious royal favour to get in. And speaking of royal favour, that was the fastest way to go from rich to mega rich. The closer you got to the king, the wealthier you were likely to become. Queen Isabella, wife of King Edward II, just straight up gave herself 20,000 marks annually in the 1330s. That's about 10 million in today's money. Self-awarded bonus, royal style, but the all-time champion of royal favouritism was Hugh Despenser the Younger. This guy was King Edward II's favourite, and by favourite, historians nudge each other and say, you know what we mean. And he got showered with gifts that would make a modern-day influencer die of envy. The king gave him the lordship of Glamorgan and several actual castles: Wallingford, Hanley, Otterham and Bristol. Imagine if the president just handed his best friend the deed to Fort Knox and was like, here, it's yours now. The other nobles were, understandably, pretty upset about this. So upset, in fact, that a war broke out between King Edward and his barons. During this conflict, Edward confiscated their lands and titles, making even more money for himself and the Despenser family. By 1326, the royal treasury contained $62,000, about $46.5 million today, all because the king liked this one guy a lot. Talk about return on relationship investment. A sudden bang on the door startles you from these thoughts. My lord, the king grows impatient. You hurry to finish dressing, fastening your cloak with a gold brooch that probably cost as much as a small farm. As you rush through the stone corridors, your boots echoing on the floor, you think about the next tier down in the medieval wealth hierarchy, the knights. Knights weren't just warriors in shining armour from the fairy tales. They were the middle management of medieval society. In 14th century England, there were about 500 of them. Unlike the higher nobles, knights had smaller manors with tenants, bringing in about $40 a year. Doesn't sound impressive until you realise a skilled labourer earned less than 3 shillings a week. That knight's annual income was over 260 times what a working man made in a week. The thing about being a knight, though, you had to actually show up and fight when called. Combat was literally in the job description, but there was a financial upside to battle that they don't usually mention in the stories. Ransoms. Yeah, that's right, if you captured an enemy in battle, especially a noble one, you could basically hold them for ransom. Medieval hostage-taking, but make it classy. When King John II of France was captured at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, his ransom was a staggering 3 million acres, or $660,000, an absolutely monstrous sum that went straight to the royal treasury. But even regular knights got in on this action. Capture a common French soldier and you could still negotiate about 60 crowns, 13, if you reached a private arrangement with their family, and if you could capture several enemies, you'd be set. It was like playing Pokemon, a historian once told me. Gotta catch 'em all, but the Pokemon are French nobles, and instead of experience points, you get actual castles. You're almost at the king's chamber now, your mind racing with thoughts of wealth and power. The guards nod as you approach, recognizing your noble status from your clothing and demeanor. As you wait to be announced, you reflect on how precarious this life is. Yes, the rewards are enormous, more wealth than most people could dream of, but one wrong move, one slip of royal favour, and it could all come crashing down. Your land seized, your title stripped, your wealth evaporating overnight. The king will see you now, announces the steward, breaking your reverie. You step forward into the royal chamber where a new opportunity or danger awaits, because in this world, wealth and power are two sides of the same blood-stained coin. For now, though, let's leave you there, at the threshold of the king's chamber, about to play the dangerous game of medieval politics. Next time, we'll see how those who prayed, the church and its representatives, amassed wealth that rivaled or even exceeded that of kings and nobles. The early morning sun is starting to filter through the narrow windows of the castle, casting long shadows across the stone floor. The day of wealth building, political manoeuvring, and survival in the brutal world of medieval nobility has just begun. And you're right in the middle of it all, feeling the weight of your sword at your hip and the even heavier weight of your precarious position in this complex hierarchy. But don't worry too much. After all, you're safely tucked in your own bed now, centuries away from the cold, damp castles and dangerous politics of medieval Europe. Your wealth might not rival a king's, but at least no one's plotting to take your head. You step back from the king's chambers, your head spinning from the political manoeuvring required just to maintain your position. As you walk down the winding stone staircase, you pass a richly dressed man in flowing robes. Unlike you, he doesn't bow or show any particular deference to your noble status. He barely acknowledges you with a slight nod. This is Bishop Edmund, and he has no reason to grovel. In the medieval power structure, he answers to God and the Pope, not your king. And his wealth, it rivals yours, maybe even exceeds it. Welcome to the second path to medieval riches, the power of prayer. Or more accurately, the power of controlling prayer. If fighting wasn't your thing, maybe you weren't born to the right family, or perhaps you just weren't keen on getting stabbed. The church offered another route to power, influence, and yes, spectacular wealth. The church, I hear you thinking, aren't they supposed to be all about poverty and humility? Yeah, that was the theory. In practice, the medieval church was possibly the most successful business enterprise in history. Let's break down this second estate, those who pray, and see how they built wealth that would make modern megachurches blush with embarrassment. The system was simple and brilliant. Everyone, from the poorest peasant to the richest noble, believed their eternal soul depended on the church. And the church, helpful organisation that it was, set up a convenient payment structure to help you avoid eternal damnation. First, there were tithes, mandatory payments of 1/10 of your annual income or produce. Not a suggestion, not a give what you can, but a straight-up 10% tax on everyone. Imagine if Amazon could force every single person to hand over 10% of their earnings, no exceptions. Then came the special occasion fees. Getting baptized, that'll cost you. Want to get married? Open that purse. Dying and need a proper Christian burial? Hope your family has some coins saved up. And don't even get me started on indulgences, paying the church to reduce your time in purgatory. It was literally selling fast passes to heaven. But the clergy took vows of poverty, you might say. Well, individual monks and priests might have been poor, but the institution they served? Filthy rich. By the 14th century, the church in England owned more land than the crown, more than the king. Let that sink in. The money flowed upward, of course. While your local parish priest might live modestly, bishops and archbishops lived like nobles. The church had created a parallel aristocracy, complete with massive landholdings, private armies, and lavish residences. You continue your walk through the castle grounds and decide to visit the nearby abbey. As you approach, you're struck by the contrast between the military austerity of the castle and the soaring, ornate architecture of the abbey church. Gold gleams from the altar inside. Colourful stained glass, an extravagant luxury, filters sunlight into rainbow patterns on stone floors. This monastery is its own economic powerhouse, a medieval corporation with diversified income streams. In 14th century England alone, there were around 1,000 religious houses, including 650 monasteries, 200 friaries, 150 nunneries, and 700 hospitals. Each controlled vast tracts of land and operated as self-contained economic units. The truly impressive ones, like the Benedictine abbeys of Glastonbury and Westminster, had annual incomes exceeding $2,000, roughly equivalent to the earnings of a top-tier earl, not too shabby for institutions founded on principles of poverty. As you enter the abbey grounds, you see industrious monks tending perfectly organised gardens, working in the brewery, copying manuscripts and directing lay workers in various crafts. This isn't just a house of prayer, it's a medieval conglomerate. Brother Cellarer, you call out to a plump monk, overseeing the loading of barrels onto a cart. He turns, recognising your noble status immediately. "My lord, what brings you to our humble monastery today?" Humble. Right. The wine he's loading is bound for markets across 3 counties. The monastery's wool will be sold as far away as Florence. Their honey, beer and cheese are renowned throughout the kingdom. "Just visiting," you reply. "The abbot is expecting me." The monk bows deeply. The abbot isn't just a spiritual leader, he's the CEO of this entire operation. In some places, abbots controlled territory so vast they were essentially independent rulers. Some even minted their own coins. As you walk toward the abbot's residence, a house far grander than most nobles could afford, you reflect on the clever business model of monasteries. They received donations of land from the pious, paid no taxes, used discounted labour, or sometimes free labour, from locals who believed they were earning spiritual credit, and then sold their products at full market rates. Plus, they were among the few institutions that could legally charge interest on loans when usury was otherwise forbidden to Christians. Banking, but make it holy. The abbot greets you in his private chambers, which are heated by a hypocaust system, an expensive luxury in medieval times. Exotic spices scent the air, and imported wine fills your cup. You're not in a simple monk's cell, you're in the home of a medieval CEO who answers only to distant shareholders in Rome. "How is business, Father Abbot?" you ask, sipping the excellent wine. "God blesses our humble work," he replies with practiced humility that doesn't reach his eyes. "Our new watermill brings in 40 shillings a week in grinding fees alone." You nod, impressed despite yourself. That's more than some knights earn in a year. But what truly set the church apart as a wealth-building institution wasn't just its business acumen, it was its accessibility. Unlike the nobility, which required the right bloodline, the church was theoretically open to all. A peasant's son could never become a duke, but he could rise to become an abbot or even a bishop. A commoner with the right connections, education, and political skill could climb the ecclesiastical ladder all the way to immense wealth and power. Take Thomas Wolsey, for example. This butcher's son from Ipswich should have had zero chance at wealth and influence in the rigid hierarchy of medieval England, but through the church he rose to become Archbishop of York in 1514, then Cardinal a year later, and eventually Lord Chancellor to King Henry VIII. "My father was a simple meat merchant," you can imagine Wolsey saying at fancy dinners, watching the nobles squirm at having to break bread with someone of such low birth. With his accumulated offices and benefices, Wolsey amassed enough wealth to spend 200,000 crowns, about 25 million in today's money, renovating Hampton Court Palace, a butcher's son living more lavishly than most of the aristocracy. That's social mobility, medieval style. Or consider John Stafford, born on the wrong side of the blanket, a polite way of saying he was illegitimate. In normal circumstances, this would have been a life-defining stigma, yet he rose to become Archbishop of Canterbury in 1443, wielding more influence than dukes of proper birth. The abbot notices your thoughtful expression. "Something troubles you, my lord." "Just considering different paths to power," you reply. He smiles, understanding completely. The church offers many blessings beyond the spiritual. Indeed it did. For ambitious families, placing a son in the church was a strategic investment. If he rose high enough, he could funnel wealth and opportunities back to his kin. Many noble houses maintained their status by having at least one son in the clergy, collecting benefices and church offices. As you leave the abbot's luxurious quarters, you encounter a young monk copying manuscripts in the scriptorium. Unlike the abbot, his robes are worn and simple, his hands ink-stained from hours of meticulous work. "Brother, where do you come from?" you ask, curious about his background. He looks up, squinting slightly after focusing so long on tiny letters. "A small village near Exeter, my lord. My father is a tanner." "And you chose the monastic life?" He smiles. "The monastery chose me. I showed aptitude for letters as a boy, and our parish priest recommended me to the abbey school. I had no inheritance to expect, but here I have found a different wealth." This young monk touches on another key aspect of ecclesiastical wealth building: education. The church controlled virtually all formal education in medieval Europe. This meant they identified and recruited the brightest minds, regardless of birth. A poor boy with exceptional intelligence could be plucked from obscurity and set on a path to power, provided he served the institution's interests. Some of these bright recruits became the administrators who managed the church's vast holdings and complex financial operations. Others became the legal minds who protected its privileges and expanded its claims. The church wasn't just wealthy, it was smartly run by the best talent scouts of the medieval period. As you wander through the monastery grounds, you notice something else. Women. In a separate section of the complex, nuns move about their business with the same industrious purpose as the monks. Medieval society offered women precious few paths to independence or power, but the church provided one, albeit a limited one. abbesses of wealthy nunneries wielded significant power. They controlled lands, managed complex enterprises, and in some cases exercised authority over nearby settlements. Some abbesses were effectively female lords running what amounted to independent economic territories. Take the Abbey of Conversano in southern Italy, where the abbess held the rank of bishop with full power over the local clergy. From 1266 until 1800, these formidable women compelled the secular priests to kiss their hands twice a year as a sign of submission. When bishops tried to challenge this privilege, the abbesses, backed by powerful noble families, pushed back hard and won. The system wasn't perfect, of course. Within monasteries and nunneries, the same class distinctions of the outside world often persisted. Noble-born monks and nuns lived in private, well-furnished cells with personalised meals, while those of common birth handled the manual labour and lived more austere lives. Even in institutions dedicated to spiritual equality, medieval social hierarchies found a way to reassert themselves. By now the sun is high in the sky, and you've spent hours observing the inner workings of this wealthy religious enterprise. As you prepare to leave, the abbot himself walks you to the gate. "Will you dine with us this evening, my lord? We've received a shipment of spices from Venice that our cook uses to magnificent effect." You politely decline, needing to return to court politics. But as you ride away, you can't help but marvel at the perfect business model the medieval church had created. They collected mandatory payments from everyone, they received tax exemptions on their vast properties, they controlled education, identifying the best minds to serve their interests, they offered one of the few paths to social advancement for commoners and women. They diversified their economic activities across agriculture, crafts and services, and they wrapped it all in the ultimate incentive structure: eternal salvation or damnation. No wonder they were rich enough to build cathedrals that still leave us awestruck today. Back at the castle, you change for the evening's banquet, your mind still comparing the two paths to medieval wealth you've now witnessed: fighting and praying. Both require shrewd political manoeuvring. Both involve controlling land and the people who work it. Both offer spectacular rewards for those who master their rules. But there's a third path you haven't yet explored, one that would eventually transform medieval society and create new kinds of wealth that even kings would envy. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your comfortable modern bed, far from the political dangers of medieval courts and monasteries, consider how different your options would be in that world. Would you choose the sword, the cross, or perhaps the marketplace? The medieval merchant class awaits in your next journey through time. For now, rest easy knowing you don't have to pay tithes or kiss an abbess's ring, unless that's somehow part of your regular Tuesday routine. Morning breaks over the castle as you stir from your bed, the memory of last night's heavy feast still sitting in your stomach. You're not particularly looking forward to another day of court politics and noble posturing. On a whim, you decide to visit the nearby town instead. "Prepare my horse," you tell your servant, "and dress me plainly. I wish to observe the market unrecognized today." Your servant looks confused, but knows better than to question you. Soon you're riding through the castle gates wearing simple clothes that won't immediately mark you as nobility. The guards still bow. They know who you are, but once you're on the road, you're just another traveller. The town comes alive as you approach. Unlike the imposing stone walls of your castle or the soaring architecture of the abbey you visited yesterday, the town is a jumble of timber-framed buildings leaning into narrow streets, smoke rising from countless chimneys. It looks chaotic compared to the ordered world of nobility and clergy. But in this chaos lies the third path to medieval wealth: commerce, the world of those who work, particularly the merchants who've transformed labour into a different kind of power. As you dismount and tie your horse, the assault on your senses is immediate. The smell of fresh bread mixes with the less pleasant odours of tanned leather, animal dung, and too many people in too small a space. Sounds overlap in a cacophony, craftsmen hammering, merchants shouting their wares, children running through narrow alleys on mysterious errands. This isn't a nobleman's world of ordered hierarchy or a monastery's world of quiet discipline. This is commerce in action, messy, vital, and surprisingly effective. Fresh fish caught this morning, shouts a woman with weathered hands and sharp eyes. Fine cloth from Flanders, calls another merchant from his stall, fabrics of blue and red catching the morning light. You push deeper into the market, amazed at the variety. Spices from the east sit next to local vegetables. Metal goods glint beside carved wooden items. Everything has a price, and everything is in motion. Near the centre of the market, you notice a different kind of building. Stone, rather than timber, with iron-barred windows and a heavy door. A money changer's house. Outside, a well-dressed man counts coins onto a portable scale while speaking rapidly to a merchant in a foreign accent. This is Giovanni, a representative of one of the Italian banking families. You've heard of them even at court. The new powers rising not through blood or faith, but through an uncanny ability to make money multiply. You edge closer, pretending to examine goods at a nearby stall while eavesdropping. The shipment from Venice arrives next week, Giovanni says, handing over a sealed document. My associates have arranged for safe passage through Bavaria, but the toll rates have increased. The merchant nods, unsurprised. The German princes grow greedier. Still, the profit margins will bear it. They speak of thousands of pounds in commerce so casually it would make even an earl blink. Yet neither man wears a sword or bears a noble title. Neither has taken religious vows. They represent something entirely different, the rising merchant class. For most of the early Middle Ages, society had been simple, if brutal. You were born a peasant, a noble, or somewhere in between, and you died in roughly the same position. The church offered some mobility, but the rest, you stayed where God put you. But something had changed around the 12th and 13th centuries. Towns expanded, trade routes stretched across Europe and beyond, and suddenly a third way to wealth emerged, one that didn't require noble birth or religious vocation. "Excuse me," you say to Giovanni after his companion leaves. "I'm curious about your business. You're from Italy." He looks you over, noting your clean hands and confident speech that betray your noble disguise. Still, merchants rarely turn down a chance to network. "Florence," he confirms. "Though our family has offices in Bruges, London, and now here." He gestures around. "A small outpost, but growing. And you deal in?" "For money, primarily. Loans, exchanges, letters of credit." He smiles thinly. The things that make other commerce possible. What Giovanni represents is revolutionary in medieval Europe. Banking on a scale never seen before. The Italian city-states, particularly Florence, Genoa and Venice, had created financial innovations that were building fortunes to rival ancient Rome's. The Medici family, for instance, started in the wool trade but opened their first bank in 1397. At their peak, they operated 9 branches across Europe's major cities. Their wealth became so enormous they essentially ruled Florence for generations and produced 2 queens of France and 4 popes. How did merchants like Giovanni and families like the Medici get so rich in a world dominated by nobles and clergy? First, they controlled the flow of goods that everyone, peasant to king, desperately wanted. Salt, spices, silk, metals, furs, all passed through merchant hands. Each transition added markup, creating profit. Second, they mastered the new financial tools, banking, credit, insurance, contracts, that multiplied money through its movement rather than just its possession. Third, they were mobile in ways nobles weren't. A lord was tied to his estates. A merchant could move capital wherever opportunity beckoned. Your business must be profitable, you comment to Giovanni. He shrugs. Some years better than others. Pirates took one of our ships last summer, but overall, yes. He leans closer. Between us, sir, a good merchant house today can turn a 40% yearly profit on invested capital. Can your farmlands claim the same? The truth is, they can't. Landed wealth is stable, but slow-growing. Merchant wealth compounds at rates that seem almost magical if you survive the considerable risks. As you thank Giovanni and continue through the market, you notice something else. The merchants don't look downtrodden like peasants. Many dress nearly as well as nobles, when sumptuary laws don't forbid it. Their homes, while in town rather than country estates, are often comfortable and well appointed. They call that one Little King, a voice says beside you. An old woman has noticed you staring at a particularly grand merchant house. Started with one cart selling wool. Now he owns half the street and has a daughter married to a knight. This was the other revolutionary aspect of merchant wealth. It could, in a generation or two, transform into gentility. The traditional barriers weren't fully gone, but they had sprung significant leaks. A merchant couldn't become a duke, but his money could buy land, which led to respectability. His son might become a knight, his daughter might marry minor nobility, his grandson might be completely accepted at court, the family's trading origins conveniently forgotten. Money, it turned out, could launder common blood given enough time and strategic marriages. You make your way to a tavern as midday approaches, taking a seat in the corner to observe the room. Here, merchants and artisans gather, discussing business over ale and bread. Their conversation ranges from wool prices to shipping routes, from town politics to distant wars that might disrupt trade. The new road toll is highway robbery, complains a cloth merchant. Still cheaper than losing a whole shipment to bandits, counters his companion. I'd rather pay the Duke for protection than end up with nothing. This dynamic, protection money flowing upward to nobility in exchange for safe roads and legal frameworks, was another pillar of medieval commerce. Merchants needed the fighters for security, but were increasingly essential to them as well. Noble lifestyles required luxury goods and ready cash that merchants could provide. The tavern keeper approaches your table. "What'll it be, sir?" "Whatever meal you're serving today," you reply, "and some information, if you're willing." He eyes the coin you place on the table. "Information's my second best-selling product. What do you want to know?" "I'm curious about a man named Francesco Dattini, an Italian merchant. Have you heard of him?" The tavern keeper's eyebrows rise. The merchant of Prato? Everyone in trade knows that name. Started as an apprentice, built an empire, supposed to be as rich as a prince now. Francesco Dattini was indeed a legend, the poster child for medieval social climbing through commerce. Born in 1335 to modest circumstances, he began as an apprentice to a Florentine merchant. Through intelligence and relentless work, he built one of the most successful trading operations of his age. His big break came when he joined traders heading to Avignon in 1358, when that city was the papal seat and booming with activity. He set up as an arms trader during the 100 Years' War, a grim but lucrative niche, and then expanded into virtually everything profitable: art, cloth, jewellery, wool, spices, metals, wheat. The smart ones diversify, the tavern keeper says, returning with a bowl of stew and a chunk of bread. Dattini never put all his coins in one purse, had trading operations, then property, then banking. That was the key insight. Successful merchants rarely stayed in just one line of business. They spread risk and seized opportunities across sectors. When Dattini finally returned to Florence with his fortune, he opened a bank and then expanded with branches in Barcelona, Valencia, Majorca, Pisa and Genoa. From nothing to international finance in one lifetime. No wonder nobles both resented and envied the merchant class. As you eat, a commotion starts outside. People are running toward the town square, excitement in their voices. You leave a coin for the meal and follow the crowd. In the square, a merchant caravan has arrived. Dozens of pack animals laden with goods, guards with swords walking alongside, merchants in dusty but fine clothing directing the operation. They've travelled hundreds of miles along dangerous roads to bring their wares here. Black pepper from the east, silks finer than a noble lady's hair, ivory and amber and spices you've never even heard of. The crowd pulses with excitement. For townspeople, a major caravan is both entertainment and opportunity, a glimpse of the wider world and access to goods they couldn't otherwise obtain. But the real story is in the economics. Each item has passed through dozens of hands, crossing cultural and linguistic boundaries, surviving hazards from shipwrecks to bandits. Each transition added to the price, and the biggest profits went to those who could bridge the most difficult gaps in the supply chain. You watch as a merchant carefully unwraps a package of what must be saffron, worth more than its weight in gold. He'll sell small portions to local nobles, wealthy townspeople, and perhaps the abbey's kitchens. This is how merchants grew rich, connecting distant markets and exploiting price differences between them. Buy pepper where it's merely expensive, sell it where it's worth a fortune. Move wool from England to Flanders where it becomes cloth, then sell that cloth back to English nobility at a markup. The trick was surviving the very real dangers of medieval commerce. Ships sank, caravans disappeared, cities imposed arbitrary taxes, pirates and bandits preyed on every route, wars disrupted everything. A merchant might make 200% profit on one venture and lose everything on the next. As the caravan master oversees the unloading of goods, you notice something else. Documents, lots of them, letters, contracts, receipts, inventories. Medieval commerce ran on a sophisticated system of record-keeping and agreements that would have impressed a royal chancellor. Is that a bill of exchange, you ask, pointing to a document changing hands. The merchant looks surprised at your knowledge, but nods. From our Florence office, allows us to move money without moving actual coins. He studies you. You have an interest in finance, sir? Bills of exchange were revolutionary, essentially medieval checks that allowed merchants to deposit money in one city and withdraw the equivalent in another, avoiding the dangers of physically transporting large sums. They also cleverly circumvented church prohibitions against charging interest by building the interest into exchange rates. I'm interested in how fortunes are made, you reply honestly. Then you should know about the Templars, he says, lowering his voice slightly, or rather their fate, a cautionary tale for any merchant who grows too rich. The Knights Templar had begun as warrior monks during the Crusades, but evolved into one of Europe's first international banking organisations. They received donations, held deposits, and managed transfers across their vast network of preceptories from England to the Holy Land. By the early 14th century, they were so wealthy that kings and nobles owed them staggering sums. When King Philip IV of France found himself deeply indebted to them, he took a ruthless approach to solving his financial problems. With the Pope's help, Philip accused the Templars of heresy, arrested dozens of them, tortured them until they confessed to imaginary crimes, and then executed them, you say, showing your familiarity with history. The merchant nods grimly and seized all their wealth in France, a convenient solution to his debts. The ultimate danger for merchants, you muse, becoming too rich for your own good. He shrugs. That's why the smart ones make friends in high places. Pay the right people, keep some wealth visible and more hidden, and remember that kings and lords still control the swords. As afternoon fades toward evening, you make your way back through the town, seeing it with new eyes. What had seemed like chaos now appears as a complex economic ecosystem, the blacksmith forging tools that farmers use to grow food that feeds everyone, the tanner preparing leather that becomes shoes that equip the traders who bring goods from afar, money and materials flowing in all directions, creating wealth through transformation and movement rather than mere possession. The medieval economy wasn't just nobles extracting from peasants, but a much more intricate dance, and those who could master its rhythms, who could see opportunities where others saw only risks, could rise from obscurity to influence in a single lifetime. Back on your horse, riding toward the castle as the sun begins to set, you reflect on the three paths to medieval wealth you've now witnessed: fighting, praying, working, each with its own rules, risks, and rewards. The noble path offered the most stable wealth but required the luck of proper birth. The church path provided the most security but demanded conformity to its hierarchy. The merchant path allowed for the fastest rise but carried the greatest dangers. As the castle looms ahead, its walls catching the last golden light of day, you wonder which path you would have chosen if born into that distant time. Would you have worn a sword, a cross, or carried a merchant's ledger? Your comfortable bed awaits, far from the dangers that stalked all three medieval paths to wealth. Medieval nobles faced battlefield death and court intrigue. Clergy lived under strict rules and the watchful eyes of superiors always alert for heresy. Merchants risked losing everything to storms, thieves, or capricious rulers. Each route to riches came with its own particular peril. Each offered a chance at wealth, but none offered true security in a world where fortune's wheel turned with merciless regularity. Tomorrow, we'll explore how these three paths intersected and competed in the complicated dance of medieval power, and see what happened when one very wealthy man decided to visit Cairo with more gold than the city had ever seen. The next morning, you wake before dawn, unsettled by dreams of endless gold coins slipping through your fingers, the various paths to wealth you've witnessed, the nobility's land-based power, the church's divine taxation, and the merchant's clever trade have left you wondering just how rich could a person become in the medieval world. Your curiosity leads you to the castle's library, a small room filled with precious manuscripts. The elderly scholar who maintains these treasures looks up as you enter. "My lord seeks knowledge this early?" he asks, setting aside a quill. "I'm interested in stories of great wealth," you explain, "beyond our borders." The old man's eyes light up. "Ah, then you must hear about Mansa Musa, whose riches surpassed anything in Christendom." Mansa Musa? The ruler of Mali, a kingdom in Africa, far to the south across the Great Desert. He pulls a large bound volume from a shelf. This record describes his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, a journey that shook the medieval world's understanding of wealth. You settle into a chair as he opens the book, revealing an illustration of a crowned black man seated on a throne, holding what appears to be a golden nugget. Imagine, The scholar begins, his voice dropping to a storyteller's cadence. A king so wealthy that when he travelled, he brought so much gold it crashed entire economies. You raise an eyebrow, sceptical. Surely that's an exaggeration. Not according to every account we have, the scholar insists. Let me tell you about wealth on a scale even emperors would envy. The Mali Empire of the 14th century wasn't just rich, it controlled the source of wealth itself. While European kings fought over farmland and castles, Mansa Musa sat atop the world's primary gold supply. Mali's gold mines in the south were so productive that this one African kingdom controlled roughly half of the world's gold output. But gold wasn't Mansa Musa's only source of wealth. His empire straddled the lucrative trans-Saharan trade routes. Salt, rare and essential for food preservation, came from the northern regions of his territory. Imagine controlling both salt and gold, the two commodities everyone desperately needed. His method was brilliant in its simplicity, the scholar explains. He taxed the salt coming from the north, taxed the gold coming from the south, and taxed all trade passing through his lands. 3 revenue streams from resources other rulers would kill to control. Over time, Mansa Musa built an empire stretching across what we now know as Senegal, Guinea, Mauritania, and Gambia. His dominion extended from the Atlantic coast inland to the trading hub of Timbuktu. At a time when European kingdoms were relatively small affairs, Mali covered a territory so vast that contemporaries claimed it would take a year to travel from one end to the other. That's likely an exaggeration, the scholar admits, but not by much. The empire was enormous. In 1324, Mansa Musa decided to make the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca required of all devout Muslims. But this wouldn't be just any religious journey. Mansa Musa would turn his pilgrimage into the greatest display of wealth the medieval world had ever seen. Wait, you interrupt. This ruler was Muslim? I thought the story would be about a Christian king. The scholar smiles patiently. The medieval world was far larger than Christendom, my lord. While European nobles fought over scraps of land, vast empires thrived elsewhere. The Muslim world stretched from Spain to India, and trade networks connected China to Africa to the Mediterranean. Wealth flowed along these routes in quantities that would make our local merchants weep with envy. You nod, somewhat chastened by your limited perspective. Continue, please. The scholar turns a page in his book. Mansa Musa's caravan consisted of 60,000 people, not a small entourage, an entire travelling city. This included 12,000 servants, all dressed in Persian silk. He brought 80 camels carrying 300 pounds of gold each. You try to picture this procession crossing the Sahara Desert, thousands of people and animals stretching to the horizon, a moving mountain of wealth making its way through one of the world's harshest environments. When this enormous caravan reached Cairo, the scholar continues, Mansa Musa did something extraordinary. He began giving away gold, not small amounts as diplomatic gifts, but with such lavish generosity that he accidentally devastated the Egyptian economy. How could giving away gold harm an economy, you ask? By suddenly flooding the market with so much of it that the metal lost value. Gold in Cairo depreciated by about 20% and took years to recover. Imagine being so wealthy that your casual spending destabilizes an entire region's currency. This story puts your previous explorations of wealth into stark perspective. The richest European nobles might own vast estates. The church might control substantial assets across Christendom. Merchants might amass impressive fortunes through trade, but none approach the concentrated wealth of Mansa Musa. The Arab historian al-Umari, who visited Cairo a decade after Mansa Musa, reported that the people still talked about the Mali king's visit, the scholar says. The gold he distributed was still in circulation, and stories of his generosity had become legendary. But where did all this gold come from? The scholar explains that Mali's wealth originated primarily from its control over the gold mines in Bambouk and Bure. Unlike European rulers who primarily taxed agricultural production, Mansa Musa derived his wealth directly from mining operations and trade taxation. The miners would pan for gold in streams or dig it from the earth, the scholar explains. The gold would then be transported along protected routes to trading hubs like Timbuktu, where it would be exchanged for salt, textiles and other goods from across the Sahara. At every step, Mansa Musa's officials collected taxes. This system created incredible wealth, but it wasn't just the result of lucky geography. Mansa Musa built upon the structures established by his predecessors, particularly Sundiata Keita, the founder of the Mali Empire. He invested in security to protect trade routes, established diplomatic relationships with neighbouring powers, and created a sophisticated administrative system to manage his vast territories. In many ways, the scholar observes, he combined all three paths to wealth we know in Europe. Like our nobility, he controlled vast territories through military power. Like our church, he integrated religious authority into governance, building mosques and Islamic universities that attracted scholars from across the Muslim world. And like our merchants, he understood the value of trade networks and market control. You rise from your chair and walk to the window, looking out over the castle grounds as you digest this information. Beyond the walls, you can see the town where you walked yesterday, its modest market a pale shadow compared to the trading empires the scholar described. Why haven't I heard these stories before, you ask? We speak of Solomon's riches or Roman emperors, but rarely of African kings. The scholar sighs. Distance, my lord, and perspective. We know what touches our world directly. Mali's gold reaches us through so many hands that its origin becomes obscured, and we tend to measure wealth by what we value. Land, castles, armies. Mansa Musa's power manifested differently, though no less impressively. You return to your seat as the scholar turns to another page, showing a map with trade routes crisscrossing Africa and connecting to the Middle East and Europe. Or, after his pilgrimage, Mansa Musa returned to Mali with architects and scholars from his travels. He built mosques and universities in Timbuktu and other cities, transforming them into centres of learning that rivaled any in the world. Students came from across Africa and the Middle East to study in these institutions. This investment in knowledge created another form of wealth, intellectual capital that further strengthened Mali's position. While European universities were still developing, Timbuktu housed libraries with thousands of manuscripts covering astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and literature. Wealth that lasts, the scholar notes, often transforms into something beyond mere gold. The truly rich build institutions, fund knowledge, create art. Their influence outlives their mortal span. As noon approaches, you thank the scholar for his insights and leave the library, your mind racing with new perspectives on wealth and power. The story of Mansa Musa offers a glimpse of how the principles of wealth building you've observed operate on a truly grand scale. Crossing the castle courtyard, you encounter a merchant who has come to sell luxury goods to the nobility. His cart contains spices, silks, and small items made of gold, the very kind of goods that might have travelled along those ancient trade routes, perhaps even originating in or passing through Mali. My lord, he bows, would you care to examine these pepper grains? From lands far to the east, very rare. You pick up a small pouch, thinking about the journey these tiny seeds have made, passed from hand to hand, increasing in value with each transaction, crossing boundaries of language, religion and empire. By the time they reached your remote corner of Europe, their price had multiplied many times over. How much? You ask. For you, my lord, only 6 silver pennies. A labourer might work 2 weeks for that amount. These small spices represent a microcosm of how medieval wealth moved and grew. Tell me, you ask the merchant as you hand over the coins, have you heard of a place called Mali? The merchant's eyes widen slightly. The Gold Kingdom beyond the desert? All merchants know that name, though few ever travel there. They say its ruler bathes in gold dust and eats from golden plates. Probably exaggerated, but the gold that flows from those lands is real enough. Even here, thousands of miles from Africa, Mansa Musa's realm has a reputation that inspires awe. As you continue your day, moving through the familiar rhythms of castle life, you find yourself seeing everything differently. The gold thread in a noblewoman's embroidery, the coins changing hands in the courtyard, the gilded cross in the castle chapel, all connected to global systems of production, trade, and wealth accumulation that stretch far beyond your immediate world. That evening, as you dine in the great hall, you study the assembled nobility with fresh eyes. Their power, derived from land and hereditary titles, seems suddenly provincial compared to the vast trading networks and resource wealth you've learned about. The earls and barons who impressed you just days ago now appear as minor players in a much larger game of wealth and influence. A visiting bishop sits at the high table, his robes marking him as a man of considerable ecclesiastical rank. Yesterday, you might have seen him primarily as a spiritual authority. Today, you recognize him as a power broker in an institution that has mastered its own path to wealth. And at the lower tables, the merchants and guild representatives who've been invited to dine, once easy to overlook amid the splendour of nobility, now catch your attention as potential players in wealth creation systems that might someday rival the traditional powers. After the meal, you find yourself in conversation with the bishop, who has travelled widely in service to the church. I've been reading about Mansa Musa today, you tell him, his pilgrimage to Mecca and the gold of Mali. The bishop nods thoughtfully. A remarkable display of earthly treasure. I spoke with a colleague who witnessed part of his procession through Cairo. He said the Mali king's generosity was matched only by his piety, building mosques along his route and making substantial donations to the poor. Is it true he destabilized Egypt's economy with his spending? So they say. Gold flowed so freely that its value dropped considerably. Merchants raised their prices in response, creating a kind of inflation that lasted years. The bishop leans closer. But what struck my colleague most wasn't just the quantity of gold, but how casually it was distributed, as if Mansa Musa's mines produced so much that he could afford such generosity without concern. This, perhaps, was the ultimate sign of wealth in the medieval world, the ability to give it away without fear of scarcity. While European nobles carefully counted their coins and the church meticulously tracked its tithes, Mansa Musa could afford a generosity that bordered on carelessness simply because his sources of wealth were so productive. Later that night, as you prepare for sleep, you reflect on how the story of this African king throws the European systems of wealth into sharp relief. The gold that powers much of Europe's economy comes largely from elsewhere, passing through many hands before reaching its ultimate destination. Those who control its sources, like Mansa Musa, hold a power that transcends traditional European hierarchies. As you drift towards sleep, you wonder about other worlds of wealth beyond your familiar experience. If an African kingdom could amass riches that dwarfed European fortunes, what other centres of wealth and power exist in the medieval world? What different paths to prosperity have others discovered? Tomorrow we'll journey even further, exploring wealth in the bustling cities of Song Dynasty China, where paper money and government monopolies created yet another model of medieval prosperity. And we'll visit the trading empires of Venice and Genoa, where merchant republics turned naval power and commercial acumen into wealth that rivaled kingdoms. For now, though, rest easy in your bed, far from the gold mines of Mali and the trading routes of the Sahara. Unlike medieval travellers, you don't need to worry about bandits stealing your wealth as you sleep. Although, come to think of it, the tax collectors might be just as persistent now as they were then. Dawn breaks over the castle, but today you're not waking up there. Instead, you find yourself on a rolling ship, the taste of salt on your lips and the endless blue of the Mediterranean stretching to the horizon. This isn't a physical teleportation, of course, just a shift in our journey through medieval wealth. The wooden vessel beneath you creaks as it cuts through waves. It's a Venetian galley, the workhorse of medieval maritime trade. Around you, sailors shout in a dialect you barely understand, while the captain checks their course against primitive but effective navigation tools. Land ho comes the cry from the crow's nest. Venice ahead. You move to the bow, straining to see through the morning mist. Slowly, impossibly, a city appears to rise directly from the sea. A maze of canals, marble palaces, and soaring towers built on what should be uninhabitable lagoon islands. Welcome to La Serenissima, the most serene Republic of Venice, the medieval world's most improbable success story, and arguably its greatest wealth creation machine. "Behold our city," says a voice beside you. You turn to see a man in rich red robes trimmed with fur, a Venetian patrician and merchant, his wealth evident in every detail of his dress. Not bad for a bunch of refugees who started with nothing but mudflats and determination, yes? He's not exaggerating. Venice began as a scattered settlement of people fleeing barbarian invasions in the 5th century, hiding in a mosquito-infested lagoon where no one else wanted to live. By the 13th century, it had transformed into a maritime empire that controlled trade routes from the eastern Mediterranean to northern Europe, with wealth that rivaled ancient Rome. As the ship glides toward the city, more details come into focus. Unlike the castle town you visited earlier, with its organic jumble of buildings, Venice appears meticulously planned. Canals functioning as watery streets, palaces rising directly from the water, and at the centre the spectacular Piazza San Marco with its basilica gleaming with gold mosaics. "Our wealth comes from the sea, not the land," the patrician explains as your ship enters the Grand Canal. "We have no fields to plough, no forests to cut. Instead, we connect worlds." This is the 5th model of medieval wealth building you're witnessing. The Maritime Republic. Neither a traditional feudal kingdom nor a church state, Venice created its own path to riches. The ship docks, and you follow your patrician guide through a city unlike any other in medieval Europe. Everywhere, evidence of extraordinary prosperity surrounds you. Marble-faced buildings, shops filled with exotic goods, well-fed citizens dressed in fabrics that would be considered luxurious elsewhere. "How did you build such wealth?" you ask, marvelling at a display of spices from the East that would cost a fortune in your homeland. The patrician stops walking and considers his answer carefully. "4 pillars support our republic's prosperity," he says, counting on his fingers. "First, geography. We sit at the crossroads of trade routes between East and West. Second, naval power. Our fleet protects our merchants and deters competitors. Third, political stability. Our unique system of government prevents any single family from seizing power. And fourth, financial innovation. We've created tools to multiply wealth beyond what traditional kingdoms can achieve." He leads you to the Rialto, Venice's commercial heart. Here, merchants gather to trade, exchange currencies, arrange shipping, and finance new ventures. The bustle is astounding. Hundreds of transactions occurring simultaneously, goods from around the known world changing hands. Couriers rushing with messages about ships arriving or departing. Or see that building? The patrician points to an imposing structure nearby. The Banco Giro, one of the world's first public banks. You can deposit gold there and receive credit notes to conduct business. No need to carry heavy coins that might be stolen or lost at sea. This financial innovation seems simple today, but was revolutionary in the medieval period. By creating secure banking systems, Venice and other Italian city-states developed a commercial infrastructure that accelerated trade and made complex international transactions possible. And over there, he continues, merchants are bidding on shares of upcoming trading voyages. Invest in a quarter of a ship's cargo. Spread your risk across multiple ventures. If one sinks, you don't lose everything. This was another breakthrough, the Commenda, a predecessor of modern investment partnerships. It allowed those with capital to fund those with commercial skills, sharing both risk and profit. A merchant didn't need to be born wealthy to succeed, he just needed to prove his abilities and attract investors. Your guide introduces you to a younger merchant finalising such a deal. This is Marco, just starting his career. He has expertise in Eastern markets but little capital of his own. Through the Commenda, he'll captain a trading voyage with other people's money. If successful, he keeps a quarter of the profits. Marco bows slightly. My father and uncle began the same way. Now they own palaces on the Grand Canal. That's another difference between us and feudal kingdoms, the patrician explains as you continue walking. Here, a man's son isn't guaranteed his father's position. Each generation must prove itself anew, and someone born with nothing, like Marco's family once was, can rise to the higher circles if they have skill and some luck. Venice wasn't alone in creating this new model of wealth. As your day continues, you find yourself magically transported to another maritime republic, Genoa, Venice's great rival on the Italian coast. If Venice impresses with its otherworldly beauty, Genoa strikes you with its raw commercial energy. Built on steep hillsides overlooking a perfect natural harbour, the city seems to cascade down to the sea. Unlike Venice's carefully planned layout, Genoa is a tangle of narrow streets and tall stone towers built by competing merchant families for both prestige and defence. We call it La Superba, the proud one, explains your new guide, a Genoese merchant with calloused hands and shrewd eyes. Not as pretty as Venice, perhaps, but just as rich, sometimes richer. The rivalry between these two maritime republics was legendary. For centuries, they competed ferociously for control of Mediterranean trade routes, sometimes through commercial tactics, sometimes through outright naval warfare. Both built colonial networks across the Mediterranean and Black Seas, establishing trading posts in places as far-flung as Crimea, Constantinople, and North Africa. Venice has its lagoon, but we have something better, your Genoese guide boasts as he leads you to a massive stone building near the harbour, the Bank of San Giorgio, the most powerful financial institution in the world. Founded in 1407, the Bank of San Giorgio represented a financial innovation even beyond what you saw in Venice. It functioned as a deposit bank, a public debt management office, and even governed some of Genoa's overseas territories. Its operations were so sophisticated that it's been called the world's first modern bank. The city's debt is converted into shares, the merchant explains. Investors receive interest payments and other privileges. Even small artisans can participate, binding everyone's financial interests to the Republic's success. This financial engineering created a stable investment vehicle and gave Genoa a steady source of capital for commercial ventures. While feudal kings were begging, borrowing, or extorting funds for their wars, Genoa had developed a sustainable financial system that made capital readily available for profitable enterprises. But our greatest achievement, the Genoese merchant says with evident pride, was breaking into the Saharan gold trade that you learned about yesterday. In the late 13th century, Genoese merchants established a trading post at Kaffa in modern-day Ukraine, creating a critical link to the eastern end of the Silk Road. From there, they gradually worked their way into the trans-Saharan trade networks that had previously been dominated by Arab and Berber merchants. We made agreements with the Mongol Khans controlling the eastern steppe, the merchant explains. This gave us access to gold, silk and spices flowing from China and Central Asia. Then we established relations with North African ports, giving us a back door into the Saharan gold trade coming up from Mali and other African kingdoms. This geopolitical manoeuvring was astonishingly bold. Small Italian city-states were negotiating directly with the Mongol Empire and Muslim sultanates, inserting themselves into trade networks that had functioned without European participation for centuries. As evening approaches, you find yourself in a Genoese merchant's home for dinner. Unlike the drafty great hall of a castle or the austere dining room of a monastery, this is a space of understated luxury. The table is set with fine ceramics imported from Islamic Spain. The food is flavoured with pepper from India and cinnamon from Ceylon. The cups are made of glass from Venice, bought grudgingly, your host admits. Our wealth is different from that of kings and lords, your host explains, as servants pour wine imported from Greek islands. They measure riches in land, castles and armed men. We measure in ships, trading contacts and financial instruments. This difference wasn't just economic, but philosophical. Maritime republics operated on principles of calculated risk rather than inherited privilege. They valued innovation over tradition, commercial acumen over noble birth. Tell him about your son, prompts your host's wife, a well-educated woman who, you've noticed, participates freely in business discussions. The merchant smiles proudly. He's studying mathematics and Arabic in our academy. Not swordsmanship or heraldry like a noble son, but skills that will help him trade effectively with our partners in Damascus and Alexandria. Knowledge is capital in our world. This educational focus represents another path to wealth creation. While nobility trained their sons for war and clergy educated theirs for church service, merchant republics invested in practical knowledge, navigation, shipbuilding, languages, mathematics, and accounting. They established schools teaching commercial skills and sent young men abroad as apprentices to learn foreign markets firsthand. After dinner, your host takes you to the rooftop terrace of his home. From this vantage point you can see Genoa's harbour filled with ships and, beyond, the vast Mediterranean stretching toward distant horizons. Every ship that returns safely represents a victory, he says, gesturing to the harbour. Not a military conquest, but a commercial one. We've learned that more wealth flows from successful trade than from successful wars. This philosophical shift marked a profound change in how some parts of medieval Europe conceptualized wealth and power. Traditional kingdoms spent enormous resources on warfare to control territory. Maritime republics invested those same resources in commercial infrastructure, ships, harbours, warehouses and trade agreements that generated returns far exceeding the original investment. But surely you still need military power, you observe, noting the armed galleys patrolling the harbour. Of course, your host acknowledges. Our navy protects our trade routes, but it's a means to commercial ends, not an end itself. When Venice and Genoa fight, it's usually over trading privileges or market access, not divine right or dynastic claims. This pragmatic approach extended to religion as well. While remaining officially Christian, maritime republics maintained business relationships with Muslim and Byzantine partners that would have scandalized more ideologically rigid European powers. Gold speaks all languages and respects all faiths, your host says with a merchant's practicality. We trade with anyone willing to trade fairly with us. As night falls over Genoa, with lanterns being lit along the harbour and on ships, you reflect on how these maritime republics created a different model of medieval wealth. Rather than extracting value from land and peasants like feudal nobles, rather than collecting tithes and donations like the church, rather than mining gold like African kingdoms, they generated wealth by facilitating exchange between distant markets. Their innovations in shipping, finance, education and governance created prosperity that transformed not just their own city-states but eventually the entire European economy. The commercial revolution they pioneered would ultimately help bring the feudal era to a close, replacing landed wealth with mercantile capital as the primary economic engine. Your host notices your thoughtful expression, contemplating the mysteries of commerce. He asks with a smile, "I'm wondering what happens when maritime wealth meets feudal power," you reply. "Who wins when merchants and nobles clash?" He laughs softly. "An excellent question. The answer is still being written, I think. But consider this. Kings may command armies, but increasingly they must come to us for loans to pay those armies. They wear crowns of gold, but we control the ships that carry that gold. The world is changing, my friend, gold coin by gold coin." As you drift off to sleep that night, back in your comfortable modern bed far from medieval Genoa, you might wonder about these competing systems of wealth creation: land-based nobility, tithe-collecting clergy, gold-controlling kingdoms, and trade-facilitating maritime republics. Each found different paths to riches in the medieval world, each with their own strengths and vulnerabilities. Tomorrow we'll explore one final medieval path to wealth, the most improbable yet potentially most significant of all, the rise of skilled urban craftspeople and how their guilds and innovations created yet another way to climb the economic ladder in an age of rigid social hierarchies. For now, though, rest easy on your pillow, far more comfortable than anything even the wealthiest Venetian doge or Genoese merchant could have enjoyed in their marble palaces. The morning light filters through a high window, casting a golden glow on your hands. These aren't the soft hands of nobility or the ink-stained fingers of a cleric. Today, they're the calloused, powerful hands of a master craftsman. You flex them experimentally, feeling the strength built from years of skilled labour. You're in a workshop in one of medieval Europe's bustling urban centres, perhaps Florence, Bruges or Nuremberg. The space around you hums with purposeful activity. Apprentices sweep the floor and prepare materials. Journeymen work on commissioned pieces under your guidance. The air smells of raw materials, particular to your craft. Maybe the tangy scent of hot metal if you're a goldsmith, the earthy richness of leather if you're a cordwainer, or the dusty sweetness of wood if you're a carpenter. This is the sixth path to medieval wealth, the way of the skilled urban craftsperson. Not as flashy as a king's gold mines, not as politically powerful as church offices, not as adventurous as a merchant's sea voyages, but a steadier, more accessible route to modest prosperity that offered surprising opportunities for advancement. Master, a young apprentice interrupts your thoughts, pointing to the street outside. The procession is starting. You nod and set aside your tools. Today is your guild's feast day, a celebration of your patron saint and a rare opportunity to publicly display the wealth and influence your craft organisation has accumulated. You don a rich wool coat, far finer than anything a rural peasant could dream of owning, and join your fellow guild members gathering in the street. The guild procession is magnificent. Each craft marches behind their banner. Goldsmiths, cloth merchants, butchers, bakers, tanners, carpenters, and dozens more. Members wear their finest clothes, often in the guild's distinctive colours. Some guilds display their masterpieces carried on decorated platforms. Others perform demonstrations of their craft skills to the cheering crowds. Quite the spectacle, observes a voice beside you. It belongs to Heinrich, a merchant visiting from another city. Your Weavers' Guild must be among the wealthiest in town. You nod with pride. Third wealthiest after the goldsmiths and cloth merchants. Not bad considering my grandfather arrived here with nothing but the clothes on his back and a knowledge of textiles from his homeland. This is no idle boast, but a common story in medieval urban centres. Unlike rural areas where social mobility remained severely limited, cities offered paths to advancement through craft specialisation. A talented apprentice could become a journeyman, a skilled journeyman could achieve master status, and a successful master could rise to guild leadership and even town governance. The cloth trade has been good to this city, Heinrich comments as you watch the colourful procession. I've heard your guild members sit on the town council. 7 out of 12 council seats, you confirm. The mayor himself was once a weaver's apprentice. This political influence represented one of the most revolutionary aspects of craft guilds. In many medieval towns, successful artisans gradually wrested control from traditional noble elites, creating governments dominated by what we might call a middle class. Neither aristocratic nor peasant, but property-owning skilled workers who had earned their status rather than inheriting it. As the procession winds through narrow streets, you explain to Heinrich how guilds functioned as both economic and social institutions. They regulated who could practice a craft, maintained quality standards, set prices, and controlled training through the apprenticeship system. But they also served as mutual aid societies, caring for elderly members, supporting widows and orphans, and even providing rudimentary banking services. Last year, when Matthias the Dyer fell ill, the guild paid for his medical care and supported his family until he recovered, you tell Heinrich. When old Wilhelm died, we ensured his widow received a pension from guild funds. We look after our own. This social safety net was crucial in an era before government welfare programs. Guild membership provided not just economic opportunity, but security against life's misfortunes, a valuable form of wealth in itself. After the procession, you invite Heinrich to continue the celebration at your home. Unlike the peasant hovels of the countryside, or even the crowded tenements of poorer urban residents, your house is substantial. 3 stories of half-timbered construction on a street of similar homes, owned by other successful artisans. Inside, the evidence of your prosperity is everywhere. The main room features a large table of polished oak, benches with cushions, a cupboard displaying pewter, and even some silver plates. Tapestries, some produced in your own workshop, hang on the walls, providing both decoration and insulation against the cold. In the kitchen, your wife directs servants preparing a feast that will include meat, white bread, and spices, luxury foods by medieval standards. You live better than some minor nobles I've visited, Heinrich remarks, accepting a cup of wine. The difference, you reply, is that everything here was earned, not inherited. My father taught me the basic skills of weaving. I travelled as a journeyman for 7 years, learning different techniques in different towns. When I returned, I created my masterpiece, that wall hanging depicting the town's founding, which earned me master status. Since then, I've built this business through skill and reputation. this meritocratic element distinguished urban craft wealth from aristocratic fortunes. While noble status came from birth and land ownership, craft status derived from demonstrable skill and business acumen. A master craftsman had to prove his abilities to his peers before earning the right to open his own workshop and train apprentices. As dinner is served, other guild members arrive with their families. The conversation flows freely, touching on business matters, town politics, and news from other trading centres. These aren't the formal hierarchical interactions of a noble court, but the comfortable exchanges of a community bound by shared occupation and civic identity. Tell Heinrich about Anton's new commission, suggests your wife, as she supervises the serving of a roasted capon. Anton, a fellow master weaver, smiles proudly. The Duke has ordered tapestries for his new hunting lodge, not just any designs, scenes of his own hunting exploits with likenesses of him and his favourite hounds. The contract will keep my workshop busy for a year. This ducal commission represents another facet of artisan wealth, the ability to capitalise on aristocratic consumption. As Europe's economy expanded in the High Middle Ages, nobles increasingly displayed their status through the acquisition of luxury goods. This created opportunities for skilled craftspeople who could produce these status symbols. The Duke could have ordered from Flemish workshops, you note, but he chose local artisans. Our reputation for quality grows, as does our influence, adds Gerhard, an older guild member who serves on the town council. With this commission we can push for the approval of our new guild hall plans. The Duke won't deny us after we've adorned his lodge so beautifully. This political manoeuvring shows how craft wealth translated into civic power. Successful guilds leveraged their economic importance to gain privileges, tax concessions, and political representation. In many towns, the craft guilds effectively became the government, controlling everything from market regulations to city defences. As the evening progresses, conversation turns to the education of children. Unlike rural peasants who simply taught their offspring basic farming skills, urban craftspeople invested heavily in more formal learning. My eldest starts university studies next year, announces Frida, a goldsmith's widow who continues to run her late husband's workshop. The guild's scholarship will cover half the cost. And my daughter will marry Conrad's son at midsummer, adds another master. Joining our workshop with his carpentry business will benefit both families. These educational and marital strategies reveal how craft families built intergenerational wealth. Sending sons to university could position them for lucrative careers in law, medicine, or church administration. Strategic marriages could combine complementary businesses or secure connections to influential families. Daughters often learned craft skills too, particularly in textile-related trades where women could achieve significant economic independence. Heinrich seems impressed by this web of opportunity. In my home city, the old noble families still control much of the council. Your craftsmen seem to have unusual influence here. It wasn't always so, Gerhard explains, settling into storytelling mode. My grandfather remembered when the bishop's men collected arbitrary taxes and the local lord demanded free goods from every workshop. But 3 generations ago, when those rulers needed funds for their wars, our guilds offered loans in exchange for written charters guaranteeing our rights. This pattern repeated across Europe as ambitious towns bought privileges from cash-strapped nobles and clergy. These charters often included the right to self-governance, freedom from certain taxes, market monopolies, and legal protections for guild members. Essentially, craftspeople purchased their economic and political freedom, converting their earnings into institutional rights that benefited everyone in their profession. After dinner, you show Heinrich your workshop's account books, another sign of how urban craft wealth differed from rural economies. While peasants might track their resources by counting livestock or measuring grain, successful artisans used sophisticated bookkeeping to manage complex business operations. Each apprentice costs this much to feed and house, you explained, pointing to neatly written figures. Each finished piece requires these materials and labour hours. My profit margin must cover guild fees, taxes, household expenses, and savings for expanding the business. This commercial mindset, calculating inputs, outputs and margins, represented a significant departure from feudal economic thinking. Craft wealth came not just from making things, but from understanding markets, managing costs and reinvesting profits strategically. As night falls, lanterns are lit throughout your comfortable home. The guests begin departing, each returning to houses that similarly reflect their status as successful artisans. These aren't palaces or castles, but they represent a standard of living unimaginable to rural peasants. Multi-room dwellings with glass windows, proper furniture, hired servants, and diets that include regular meat and white bread. Your guild members seem content with their station, Heinrich observes as the last guests leave. Neither grand nobles nor humble labourers, but something in between. We've found our own place, you agree. Not ruling from remote castles or praying in cloistered monasteries, but building communities where skill earns respect and prosperity. This middle path had profound implications for medieval society. By creating economic niches between peasantry and nobility, craft guilds established a prototype for what would later be called the middle class. Their wealth came not from exploiting the labour of others, though apprentices might disagree, but from applying specialised knowledge to create goods of value. Before Heinrich leaves, you show him one final aspect of craft wealth, your workshop's masterpiece collection. These are the exceptional works created by journeymen to demonstrate their readiness for master status, preserved as both guild history and quality benchmarks. Each piece represents years of training, you explain, pointing out the intricate weaving patterns, complex colour work and flawless execution. Not just technical skill, but artistic vision and problem-solving ability. This is the true wealth of our craft, knowledge passed down and improved upon for generations. This intangible asset, accumulated craft knowledge, may have been the most revolutionary form of medieval wealth. Unlike land that could be seized by force or gold that could be stolen, specialised craft skills resided in the minds and hands of practitioners. It could only be acquired through years of training and could travel wherever the craftsperson went. If a city became oppressive or economically depressed, skilled artisans could simply relocate to more favourable locations, taking their valuable knowledge with them. This mobility gave craft guilds significant leverage. Towns competed for skilled artisans by offering tax incentives, political rights and favourable business conditions. A master craftsman with a reputation for quality work might receive offers from multiple cities, each promising better terms than the last. As you bid Heinrich goodnight, you reflect on the peculiar security of your position. You're not as wealthy as a great merchant or noble lord, but your prosperity rests on foundations they might envy. Skills that can't be confiscated, a community that provides mutual support, and a political voice in local governance. Safe travels, you tell your guest as he departs into the torchlit street. Perhaps next year you'll visit during the trade fair, when craftspeople from 20 towns display their finest work. I would like that, Heinrich replies. Your city shows what's possible when those who work with their hands also have a hand in governance. As the sound of Heinrich's footsteps fades into the night, you secure your home, locking doors and checking that the fire is safely banked. Tomorrow brings another day of workshop management, apprentice training and guild responsibilities. Your wealth doesn't allow the leisure of nobility, but it provides something they often lack, the satisfaction of creating tangible value through skilled labour. Lying in your bed, more comfortable than a peasant's straw pallet, but less grand than a noble's canopied expanse, you consider the different forms of medieval wealth you embody. You possess material comfort, social standing, political rights, specialised knowledge and membership in a supportive community. Not the dazzling riches of kings or the vast land holdings of great lords, but a more accessible prosperity that rewards skill, diligence and business sense. In your own way, you've solved the riddle of medieval social advancement, finding a path between the rigid categories of those who fight, those who pray, and those who work. You've become something different, one who creates, one who trades, one who builds not just products but institutions that might outlast kingdoms. And in your warm, secure home in a self-governing town, surrounded by the fruits of your skilled labour, you've achieved something even the wealthiest medieval king might envy, a life largely of your own making. Rest easy now in your modern bed, far more comfortable than even the finest medieval craftsman could imagine. Tomorrow we'll explore our final path to medieval riches, the dangerous but potentially lucrative world of medieval adventurers, mercenaries and treasure hunters who gambled everything on high-risk, high-reward enterprises at the margins of medieval society. You wake with a start, heart pounding. The comfortable craftsman's bed is gone, replaced by hard ground beneath a woolen blanket that reeks of smoke and sweat. Around you, men sleep fitfully, weapons within easy reach. The pre-dawn air is cold enough to see your breath, and somewhere beyond the camp, a wolf howls. Welcome to the seventh path to medieval wealth, the dangerous, desperate, often bloody route of the adventurer. You've left behind the structured worlds of nobility, clergy, merchants and craftsmen for the chaotic margins where fortune favours the bold, or crushes them completely. Up, you lazy dogs! A gruff voice cuts through the morning mist. Client pays for a full day's work and the sun's almost showing. You rise quickly, strapping on a sword that feels unnervingly familiar in your hand. Today, you're a mercenary, a professional fighter who sells his sword to the highest bidder. Not the honourable knight bound by oaths to a lord, but a free agent in the medieval marketplace of violence. The man shouting is Sir John Hawkwood, captain of your company and one of the most successful mercenaries of the 14th century. An Englishman who fought in the 100 Years' War, he later brought his military expertise to Italy, where city-states paid handsomely for professional fighters to settle their disputes. Eat quickly, Hawkwood orders as hardtack and dried meat are distributed. The Florentines are paying us to intimidate their neighbours, not to sleep late and fatten ourselves. Though he sounds harsh, you know Hawkwood is actually one of the more reliable mercenary captains. Born to a humble leather tanner in Essex, England, he transformed himself through military skill into Giovanni Acuto, a respected condottiere who eventually became a knight, married into Italian nobility, and amassed enough wealth to rival established aristocrats. Or remember, Hawkwood addresses the assembled men, we're being paid to make a show of force today, not to fight unless provoked. A smart mercenary knows that staying alive to collect the next contract is better than dying gloriously. This pragmatic approach to warfare, treating it as a business rather than a matter of honour, characterised successful mercenary companies. They weren't fighting for God, king or country, but for profit, and they developed business models to maximise returns while minimising risks. As your company marches along dusty Italian roads, you fall into conversation with an older fighter whose face bears the scars of many campaigns. Been with Hawkwood long, you ask? The veteran nods. 7 years. Best captain I've served under. Pays on time, doesn't waste our lives in hopeless battles, and gives us our fair share of any booty. Is the pay good? He laughs. Better than farming someone else's land or sweating in a workshop. A skilled man-at-arms can earn more in a month's campaign than a peasant sees in years, if you survive, of course. Therein lay both the appeal and danger of the mercenary path to wealth. The financial rewards could be substantial. Successful captains like Hawkwood ended their careers with estates, titles and fortunes that would have been unimaginable had they remained in their original social positions. But the risks were equally substantial. Death, dismemberment, or finding yourself on the losing side of a conflict with no pay and a price on your head. By midday, your company has reached its destination, a strategic hilltop overlooking disputed territory between Florence and a rival city-state. As you establish camp in a display of military presence, Hawkwood gathers his lieutenants. Florence pays well, but we should keep our options open, he says quietly. Send scouts to assess what their rivals might offer for our services. Remember, loyalty lasts as long as the contract. This mercenary pragmatism, selling services to the highest bidder and switching sides when profitable, often shocked traditional nobles bound by feudal oaths. But in the fragmented political landscape of medieval Italy, where numerous wealthy city-states competed for power, it created a seller's market for military expertise. The smart companies don't just fight, explains a lieutenant named Paolo, a Venetian who abandoned a merchant career for the more exciting life of a mercenary. We broker peace deals, provide security for trade routes, escort valuable shipments. War is just one service we offer. Indeed, the most successful mercenary captains functioned as military entrepreneurs, identifying market needs and adapting their services accordingly. Some, like Sir John Hawkwood, became so valuable that cities retained them on annual contracts just to ensure they wouldn't fight for rivals. As evening approaches, another type of adventurer arrives at your camp, a weather-beaten man leading a mule laden with small wooden boxes and cloth-wrapped bundles. "Ah, Lorenzo arrives," calls Paolo with evident pleasure. "Now we'll have something interesting to liven the night." Lorenzo is a relic trader, another high-risk, high-reward occupation in the medieval world. He travels dangerous roads carrying precious religious artifacts for sale to churches, monasteries, and wealthy, pious individuals. "What treasures have you brought this time?" Hawkwood asks as Lorenzo unpacks by the campfire. With a flourish, the relic trader reveals his wares: tiny fragments of bone in jewelled reliquaries, vials of supposedly holy water, pieces of cloth claimed to be from saints' garments, and small metal containers purportedly containing earth from sacred sites. "A splinter from the true cross," Lorenzo announces, holding up a small crystal container with a sliver of dark wood. "From Constantinople itself, certified by a Greek patriarch." You notice Hawkwood's sceptical expression, but also how several men cross themselves reverently. Whether these relics are genuine is almost beside the point. In a medieval economy where faith and commerce intertwined, religious artifacts commanded extraordinary prices. "And how much for this certified splinter?" asks Hawkwood dryly. "For you, Captain, a special price, only 40 florins. That's roughly equivalent to what a skilled craftsman might earn in 6 months. A small fortune for a tiny fragment of wood, yet Lorenzo likely has no shortage of buyers. Relics with a medieval equivalent of celebrity memorabilia, status symbols that demonstrated both piety and wealth. Churches and monasteries competed to acquire impressive collections that would attract pilgrims and their donations. "I don't suppose you accept credit?" jokes one of the mercenaries. "Perhaps you could put me down for a payment after our next contract?" Lorenzo laughs. "My friend, I deal in certainties, not promises. Gold in hand or no transaction." Like mercenaries, relic traders operated in a high-risk environment where trust was scarce and reputation essential. Lorenzo has built his business on delivering what he promises, not necessarily authentic relics, virtually impossible to verify, but items with convincing documentation and presentation that satisfied his customers' needs. As night falls and the camp settles, another visitor arrives, a knight wearing the cross of a crusader, his once fine surcoat now worn and travel-stained. "Sir Giles returns from the Holy Land," murmurs Paolo. "Let's hear what fortune he found there." The crusading knight joins your fireside circle, accepting a cup of wine with grateful hands that tremble slightly from exhaustion or perhaps illness. 3 years, he says, after a long drink. 3 years in lands of heat and strange tongues, fighting for God and gold. "And which proved more generous?" asks Hawkwood with characteristic directness. Sir Giles smiles ruefully. "God offers rewards in the next life. This one proved less bountiful than I'd hoped." The Crusader represents yet another medieval wealth-seeking adventurer. While religious zeal motivated many who took the cross, economic opportunity played an undeniable role in the crusading movement. For younger sons of nobility who wouldn't inherit family estates, for knights seeking to escape debts or criminal charges, for ambitious commoners hoping to rise through military service, the Crusades offered a sanctified path to potential fortune. "Not all return empty-handed," Hawkwood observes. "I've known men who captured Muslim nobles for ransom or claimed abandoned properties in conquered territories." "True enough," agrees Sir Giles. "Some found wealth beyond imagining. I met a Venetian in Acre who made a fortune shipping sugar and spices back to Europe. A German knight now owns 3 villages near Jerusalem. A French baker became rich supplying bread to the Christian armies." But for every success story, dozens of crusaders died of disease, battle wounds, or starvation. Others returned financially ruined, having spent their life savings equipping themselves for a campaign that yielded no return on investment. As conversations continue around the campfire, you notice a quiet man sitting apart from the others, methodically cleaning a set of unusual tools. Not weapons, but measuring devices, small hammers, chisels, and what appears to be a crude compass. "That's Martin," Paolo tells you, following your gaze, "a mining engineer from German lands. Hawkwood hired him to assess mineral deposits in territories we secure." Martin represents one more type of medieval wealth-seeking adventurer, the technical specialist whose rare knowledge could transform worthless land into valuable property. Mining experts, irrigation engineers, and land reclamation specialists commanded premium fees for their ability to identify and extract resources others couldn't recognize or access. "Found anything promising?" you ask, moving to sit beside the engineer. Martin glances around cautiously before answering. "Perhaps. There are signs of silver in the hills we passed yesterday. Not a major deposit, but potentially profitable with proper development." "And what's your share if you're right?" 10% of production for the first 5 years. He smiles slightly. "Enough to retire comfortably if the vein is as good as I suspect." This arrangement, trading expertise for a percentage of future profits, created opportunities for social advancement that bypassed traditional hierarchies. A successful mining engineer might begin as a simple craftsman, but end as a wealthy property owner, respected for technical knowledge that neither nobles nor clergy possessed. As night deepens, the conversation around the fire turns to other adventurous paths to medieval wealth, treasure hunting in ancient ruins, diving for shipwrecks in the Mediterranean, capturing exotic animals for noble menageries, or searching remote mountains for rare medicinal herbs. My cousin joined an expedition to find Alexander's tomb, offers one mercenary. Never returned, but the stories say it's filled with unimaginable treasures. Better than Marcus, counters another, spent 3 years searching for a legendary gold mine in Hungary based on an old map, found nothing but fever and an early grave. These treasure-seeking ventures represented the medieval equivalent of start-up companies, high-risk investments that usually failed but occasionally yielded spectacular returns. Like modern venture capitalists, wealthy backers might fund multiple expeditions, knowing most would fail, but hoping one success would compensate for many losses. Hawkwood listens to these tales with the skepticism of a man who has found his own reliable path to wealth. Dreams and schemes, he says dismissively, give me a solid contract with a wealthy city-state over treasure maps and legends. Yet even Hawkwood's mercenary career represents a form of high-risk entrepreneurship. He invested his military expertise and leadership skills in ventures that could have ended in disaster, but instead yielded substantial returns. As the fire burns low and men begin seeking their bedrolls, you reflect on how these adventurers differ from the other medieval wealth builders you've encountered. Unlike nobles who inherited status, clergy who rose through institutional structures, merchants who built on family connections, or craftsmen who progressed through guild hierarchies, these men operate outside established systems. They're opportunists and risk-takers, leveraging specialized skills or sheer courage to seize chances that others miss or fear to attempt. Their paths to wealth aren't reliable or repeatable. They depend on timing, luck, and individual boldness as much as skill or planning. Yet their stories reveal something important about medieval society. Despite its seemingly rigid hierarchies, cracks and openings existed where ambitious individuals could slip through conventional barriers. A tanner's son could become a knighted military leader. A peasant with geological knowledge could earn a mining fortune. A clever trader could profit from the intersection of faith and commerce. These exceptional cases didn't change the fundamental structures of medieval society, but they created pressure points and alternative models that would eventually contribute to broader social transformations. As you drift towards sleep on the hard ground of the mercenary camp, distant from the comfortable certainties of castle, monastery, merchant house, or craftsman's dwelling, you appreciate both the freedom and precarity of the adventurer's life. Tomorrow might bring wealth beyond imagining, or disaster beyond recovery. The margins offer opportunity, but no security, potential riches, but no guarantees. Perhaps that's why these adventurers' stories continue to captivate us centuries later. In their willingness to gamble everything on uncertain ventures, they embody both the constraints of medieval society and the universal human desire to transcend those constraints, to rise through boldness, cleverness, or simple stubborn persistence. While we admire the stability achieved by nobles, clergy, merchants, and craftsmen, something in us resonates with the mercenary captain who carved his own path, the relic trader who profited from others' faith, the crusader who sought fortune in distant lands, or the engineer whose specialized knowledge trumped social status. Their medieval gambles may seem foreign to our modern sensibilities, but their entrepreneurial spirit feels surprisingly familiar. In their willingness to risk everything for a chance at transformation, we perhaps see reflections of our own dreams and ambitions. Sleep now, safe in your modern bed, far from the dangers these medieval adventurers faced. Tomorrow, in our final journey, we'll bring together all 7 paths to medieval wealth and explore how they interacted, competed, and eventually transformed as the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance and the modern economic world began to emerge. Rest well knowing you don't need to sell your sword, hunt for relics, join a crusade, or search for hidden mines to secure your future. The adventurer's path to wealth was the most thrilling but also the most treacherous, a route best experienced through stories rather than lived reality. Morning light filters through your window, but this time you're not in a castle, monastery, merchant's villa, craftsman's house, or mercenary camp. You're in a grand chamber unlike any you've seen before, a room that somehow embodies all the medieval paths to wealth you've experienced. The stone walls suggest nobility, but they're adorned with merchants' maps and craftsmen's tools. Religious icons share space with mercenary weapons. A banker's ledger lies open beside architectural plans for a cathedral. Gold coins from Mali sit in a dish next to Venetian glass and Baltic amber. A strange figure stands by the window, a person whose clothing incorporates elements from every medieval estate. Part noble lord, part cleric, part merchant, part craftsman, part adventurer. Welcome to the crossroads, they say, turning to face you. You've walked the 7 paths of medieval wealth. Now it's time to understand how they all connected. This final day of our journey won't introduce new ways to get rich in the Middle Ages. Instead, we'll explore how these different wealth systems interacted, competed, and eventually transformed as the medieval world gave way to the Renaissance and early modern period. Think of medieval wealth as a complex ecosystem rather than isolated paths, your guide explains. Like any ecosystem, each part influenced the others, creating tensions and opportunities that would eventually transform the entire system. Consider how these wealth paths interacted. When ambitious nobles needed funds beyond what their lands produced, they borrowed from Italian banking houses, creating financial relationships that complicated traditional power structures. A duke might command armies, but if he owed enormous sums to Florentine bankers, who truly held power? When the church accumulated vast land holdings, it began functioning like a noble estate while still claiming spiritual authority and tax privileges. This hybrid position created both opportunities. Church offices became attractive career paths for younger noble sons, and tensions. Secular rulers grew resentful of untaxable church wealth. When merchants grew wealthy enough to buy land and titles, they blurred the line between commercial and aristocratic wealth. The son of a successful trader might become a knight, marry into minor nobility, and within a generation or two his descendants would be indistinguishable from old, noble families. When craft guilds gained control of town governments, they established regulatory systems that protected their economic interests while limiting traditional noble authority within city walls. A count might rule the countryside, but within Florence or Bruges, guild masters made the laws. When adventurers like mercenary captains accumulated enough wealth to purchase estates, they converted risky mobile capital into the stable, inherited wealth form preferred by medieval society. The successful mercenary's grandchildren might become respected landowners with no memory of how their position was originally acquired. These interactions created a dynamic medieval economy that was far more complex than the simple 3 estates model suggests, your guide observes, leading you to a table covered with documents and artifacts. But they also created contradictions that would eventually transform European society. The most significant tension existed between land-based and commercial wealth. The feudal system presumed that true power came from controlling territory and the people who worked it, but as trade expanded and financial instruments grew more sophisticated, money itself became an alternative form of power, more liquid, more flexible, and sometimes more useful than land. A dramatic example appears in a document on the table, a contract between King Edward III of England and Florentine banking houses to finance his war against France. Edward borrowed enormous sums from Italian bankers. When he defaulted on these loans in 1345, the resulting financial crisis bankrupted many of Europe's largest banks and contributed to economic depression across the continent. Here we see a medieval king wielding traditional authority while simultaneously depending on commercial wealth systems, your guide explains. When these systems collided, the results were felt from London to Florence. This interdependence between old and new wealth forms characterized the late medieval period. Kings needed merchants and bankers to finance their ambitions. The church relied on artisans to build its cathedrals and merchants to manage its finances. Guild craftsmen needed noble and clerical customers for their luxury products. Each wealth system remained distinct but increasingly entangled with the others. Now look at this, your guide says, pointing to a painting of a richly dressed man with his family, Lorenzo de' Medici, a man whose life embodies the convergence of medieval wealth paths. The Medici began as wool traders, became bankers, purchased land, received noble titles, placed family members in church offices, including the papacy, patronized craftsmen, and even employed mercenaries. They moved fluidly between wealth systems that were theoretically separate, leveraging each to strengthen their position in the others. He doesn't look like he's struggling with contradictions, you observe, noting Lorenzo's confident expression. Exactly, your guide nods. By the 15th century, innovative individuals and families were finding ways to integrate these different wealth forms. They were creating something new, what we might call Renaissance economic thinking. This integration manifested in several ways. Double-entry bookkeeping, developed by Italian merchants, was adopted by church administrators and noble estate managers, bringing commercial accounting practices to traditional institutions. Banking services initially designed for merchant needs expanded to serve kings, popes, and eventually ordinary craftsmen, creating financial networks that crossed social boundaries. Education evolved from a church monopoly to include commercial and technical knowledge, with new schools teaching mathematics, languages, and other skills useful for trade alongside traditional subjects. Art patronage shifted from being primarily religious, commissioned by the church, to include secular subjects commissioned by merchants and nobles, creating new markets for craftsmen's skills. Urban planning incorporated elements from multiple traditions. The defensive concerns of nobility, the ceremonial spaces needed by the church, the commercial areas required by merchants, and the workshop districts essential to craftsmen. This integration wasn't smooth or universal, your guide cautions, leading you to a window overlooking a medieval city where different districts clearly reflect their distinct origins and purposes. Traditional and innovative wealth systems coexisted, sometimes cooperatively, sometimes competitively. In some regions, the old feudal economy remained dominant, with land ownership and noble birth still determining status and opportunity. In others, particularly northern Italian and Flemish cities, commercial wealth gained primacy, with merchant families effectively controlling political and cultural life regardless of their origins. Hey, I've been wondering something, you say, turning from the window. With all these paths to wealth, was medieval society actually more economically mobile than we think? Your guide smiles at the question. Yes and no. The majority of people remained locked in the circumstances of their birth. A peasant's son usually died a peasant, but the exceptions are more numerous and significant than often recognised. These exceptions matter because they created precedents and models that would eventually influence broader social change. When a butcher's son like Thomas Wolsey could rise to become a cardinal and the king's chief minister, or a merchant family like the Medici could place members on ducal thrones and the papal seat, they demonstrated possibilities beyond traditional limitations. Think of it as pressure building in a system, your guide suggests. Each exceptional case, each merchant who bought nobility, each craftsman who gained political power, each adventurer who found fortune, added stress to rigid social categories. Eventually, these categories began to crack and transform. By the late medieval period, wealth itself was becoming more important than its source. A rich merchant might still face social prejudice from old money nobility, but his practical power, his ability to build, buy, influence, and create often exceeded that of landed aristocrats with impressive titles but empty treasuries. This shift accelerated with several historical developments, your guide explains, pointing to images representing key late medieval events. The Black Death reduced population, increasing the value of labour and challenging traditional power structures. The development of gunpowder weapons undermined the military advantage of the knightly class. The invention of the printing press democratised knowledge previously controlled by clerical elites. Each development affected different wealth paths in different ways. The nobility found their military value diminished by new weapons and tactics that didn't require lifelong training. Many adapted by becoming administrators, diplomats, or court figures rather than warriors. The Church faced challenges to its intellectual monopoly and growing criticism of its wealth accumulation, eventually leading to the Protestant Reformation that would fundamentally alter its economic position. Merchants benefited from expanding global connections as European voyages reached the Americas, Africa, and Asia, creating new trade opportunities but also increasing competition and risk. Craftsmen saw their guild protections challenged by early industrial production methods that prioritized quantity over traditional quality standards, forcing adaptation or decline. Adventurers found new frontiers to explore but faced more organised competition as royal governments took greater control of colonial enterprises. The medieval wealth systems didn't disappear, your guide emphasises. They transformed. Elements of each survived in the early modern economy, often in forms that would be recognisable to their medieval practitioners. Modern landed aristocracy evolved from feudal nobility but with property rights more similar to those of merchants. Banking institutions developed from medieval Italian precedents but with more sophisticated financial instruments. Colonial trading companies combined aspects of merchant ventures and state power. Guilds gradually gave way to early factories but left legacies in apprenticeship systems and quality regulations. What can we learn from these medieval wealth paths, you ask, genuinely curious about the relevance to our own time? Your guide considers the question carefully before responding. Perhaps that economic systems are always more complex and interconnected than they first appear. That innovation often happens at the boundaries between different traditions. That new forms of wealth don't simply replace old ones, but integrate with and transform them. There's also something reassuring about recognizing how people throughout history have found ways to improve their circumstances despite significant constraints. the medieval peasant who placed his talented son in a monastery, hoping for advancement through education, the town craftsman who joined a guild to gain security and opportunity, the merchant who risked everything on a dangerous voyage seeking profits from distant markets. These weren't just economic strategies, but human stories of ambition, risk, and occasional triumph against considerable odds. I've noticed something else, you add. Each wealth path had its own distinct values and perspectives. Nobles emphasized lineage and martial virtues. The church prioritized institutional perpetuity. Merchants valued calculated risk and networking. Craftsmen respected skill and quality. Adventurers prized individual boldness. Excellent observation, your guide nods approvingly. These weren't just different ways of making money, but different worldviews that shaped everything from architecture to family structure to concepts of time. Consider how differently these groups approached the future. The nobility thought in generational terms, preserving and expanding family landholdings that would pass to descendants hundreds of years later. The church planned in terms of centuries, building cathedrals that might take 100 years to complete and establishing institutions meant to last until Judgment Day. Merchants balanced immediate opportunities with medium-term investments. A trading voyage might take months, while establishing a branch office in another city represented a commitment of years. Craftsmen invested in skills and reputations developed over decades. A master might spend 40 years perfecting techniques that would be passed to the next generation. Adventurers often focused on the immediate prospect, the current campaign, expedition, or venture that might yield quick wealth or sudden disaster. These different temporal perspectives influenced how each group used their wealth, what they valued, and how they interacted with others. A noble might view a merchant's focus on quick profit as short-sighted, while the merchant might see the noble's attachment to ancestral lands as inflexible. As we conclude our journey, your guide says, remember that medieval wealth wasn't just about accumulation, but about different visions of what wealth was for and how it should be used. Some built monuments meant to last centuries, others invested in knowledge and institutions, some created beautiful objects combining utility and artistry, others focused on immediate pleasures or security for their families. In that way, perhaps we're not so different from our medieval ancestors, your guide observes. We still balance similar concerns, even if our economic systems have evolved. As afternoon light slants through the windows, your guide leads you to a final artifact, a medieval map showing the known world with Jerusalem at its centre. Trade routes crisscross continents, connecting the gold mines of Mali to the spice markets of India to the wool producers of England in a complex web of economic exchange. What strikes me about this map, your guide says, is how it shows connection rather than separation. Despite the distinct paths we've explored, medieval wealth ultimately formed a single system spanning continents and crossing boundaries of faith, culture, and social station. The gold that paid for European cathedrals often came from African mines. The spices served at noble feasts travelled from Asian farms through Arab merchants and Italian traders before reaching French or English tables. The textiles worn by clergy might combine English wool, Mediterranean dyes, and craftsmanship from Flemish guilds. Perhaps that's the final lesson your guide suggests, that wealth, even in a supposedly rigid and hierarchical age, created connections that transcended the very categories it seemed to reinforce. As evening approaches, your guide leads you to comfortable chairs beside a warm hearth. The day's explorations have left you thoughtful, contemplating how these medieval patterns might still influence our modern relationship with wealth and value. Any final questions before our journey ends? Your guide asks, pouring 2 cups of spiced wine, reminiscent of what a successful merchant might have enjoyed centuries ago. Just one, you reply. With all these different paths, what was the best way to get rich in the Middle Ages? Your guide laughs softly. The same as today, perhaps. Choose your parents wisely. Being born into wealth remained the surest path, despite all the exceptions we've discussed. As night falls, your guide rises and gestures toward a door you hadn't noticed before. It's time to return to your world, they say, but perhaps you'll carry something from these medieval paths with you. Not gold or land or titles, but perspective, an appreciation for how people throughout history have balanced risk and security, tradition and innovation, individual ambition and community belonging in their pursuit of better lives for themselves and their families. You step through the door and find yourself back in your own bed, in your own time. The medieval world with its castles and monasteries, its merchant ships and craft guilds, its adventurers and innovators fades like a dream at dawn. But perhaps tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you'll see those medieval wealth seekers a bit differently. Not as distant figures locked in an alien economic system, but as people navigating constraints and seeking opportunities in ways that might not be so unlike our own efforts. Sleep well, comfortable in your modern bed, free from the physical hardships that even the wealthiest medieval king or merchant prince couldn't escape, yet connected across centuries by the common human experiences of working, trading, creating, adventuring, and building futures that extend beyond our individual lives. The paths to wealth may change through the ages, but the hope for security, opportunity, and meaning that drives us along those paths remains remarkably constant, a thread connecting us to those who walked the 7 roads of medieval prosperity, seeking fortune in a world both vastly different from and surprisingly similar to our own.